With us tonight, from wherever you may be watching and listening tonight, we welcome you, whether that's from part of our church family here in Tampa Bay or whether you are in some other part of the country tonight. We welcome you and thank you for being with us. We appreciate so much you opening the Bible and studying with us. Tonight, we're looking at 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 as we continue our study in life as it was meant to be. 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. We're going to read together in that place in just a moment. We want to remind you that while we have been live streaming a Bible class on Sunday morning at 9 a.m., that will not be the case for the time being. Our Sunday assemblies that will begin back in our building this week, we will meet first at 9 a.m., and so it precludes that Bible class. And so that class will be made available Saturday night at 7 o'clock. It'll be pre-recorded. You can access it Saturday night at 7 o'clock. You can watch it whenever you'd like at your convenience, but it will be made available then. I'll be teaching again in that class period, and so we will have the second half really of 1 Thessalonians 3. And so that kind of gives you an update about that. We've got several things to mention to you at the end of our service tonight as we contemplate coming back to our building on Sunday and as we talk about a variety of other things that I think you'll want to be made aware of. So we make you aware of that. Hope you'll stay with us to the very end tonight as we bring you up to date about some family matters. All right. 1 Thessalonians 3, beginning in verse 1. Do you have your Bible? I want us to read this chapter together, and then we're going to come back and we're going to develop really just two or three themes from this chapter tonight as we talk about what brethren need to survive. Paul is, in this chapter, talking about difficulties that come to Christians in the world and how much, therefore, we need each other. Now, we've had a living illustration of that over the past 3 months, haven't we? But let's read together what he says about that. 1 Thessalonians 3, beginning in verse 1. Can you read with me, please? Therefore, when we could no longer endure it, we thought it good to be left in Athens alone. And we sent Timothy, our brother and minister of God, and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you, to encourage you concerning your faith, that no one should be shaken by these afflictions. You yourselves know we were appointed to this. For in fact, we told you before when we were with you that we would suffer tribulation, just as it happened, as you know. For this reason, when I could no longer endure it, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter had tempted you, and our labor might be in vain. But now that Timothy has come to us from you, and brought us good news of your faith and love, and that you always have a good remembrance of us, greatly desiring to see us, as we also to see you. Therefore, brethren, in all our affliction and distress, we were comforted concerning you by your faith. For now we live, if you stand fast in the Lord. For what thanks can we render to God for you, for all the joy which we rejoice for your sake before our God, night and day, praying exceedingly that we may see your face, and perfect what is lacking in your faith. Here's how he winds up the chapter. Now, may our God and Father himself and our Lord Jesus Christ direct our way to you, and may the Lord make you increase and abound in love to one another and to all, just as we do to you, so that he may establish your hearts blameless in holiness before our God and Father at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ with all of his saints. And we'll stop right there. You know, one of the things that immediately impresses me when I read this chapter is some of the terminology that Paul uses. I'm immediately impressed with how, first of all, short the chapter is, but how personal the chapter is. And so, in this chapter, he uses the word we 15 times, and he uses the word you 15 times. We and you. We and you. And the point is that we and you, those words sum what the chapter really is about. The we's were concerned about the you's. And as he talks, it becomes apparent that the you's were concerned about the we's, that is Paul and his compatriots as well. And so this chapter uses that concept over and over and over, 15 times. We, 15 times. You, 30 times total, where he's saying, look, we're in this. We are in this together. Now, Paul's great point of concern were the fact that he had gone to Thessalonica and he had taught these brethren that he pretty quickly had to leave. And so his concern was their faith. He left them, as it were, home alone. Just like in the movie, somebody that was too young to be left alone. But he had to do that. He had to leave them alone. And so they were, in many ways, home alone. And so he wondered about them. He worried about them, just like a parent would be concerned about a child. In fact, look at his terminology in verse 1. Therefore, when we could not stand it any longer, we thought it good to be left alone and send Timothy to you. And in verse 5, when I could no longer stand it, I sent Timothy to know how you were doing. Well, that's what a parent would do. He just says, look, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know how you were doing. And so he says, I sent Timothy. Could I just expand on that and say that concern about brethren was serious business with the Apostle Paul. In fact, to the Corinthians, he said, look, as he was describing all the things that he endured for Christ, he said, and besides all these other things, that which comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. Paul just says, you know what, man, I love Christians everywhere. Have tremendous concern about Christians everywhere. Boy, wouldn't it be true, ladies and gentlemen, that the state of any church would be improved if everybody was more concerned about the faith of others. I think we do that exceptionally well in this church, and I'm really, really thankful and grateful for that. I've known of places where what the brethren were concerned about was whether or not they were noticed as they should be, or maybe used as much as they think they should be, or somebody else got an invitation to something they didn't get. And I'm so grateful that we're just not consumed with those kinds of petty things. I will tell you that I think what is a challenge for churches in 2020 that we would do really well to think about is that sometimes it's very easy to be concerned when someone doesn't agree with us politically. Now, we've had a lot to say about that in the early part of this year. But I hark back to Kevin Clark when he was with us last September. And remember, the very first sermon that Kevin preached on the Friday night of his gospel meeting was about the Christian's relationship to politics and government. And I got to tell you, I think that as we go toward the remainder of this year, and as politics will really begin to heat up, especially this summer with the conventions, whatever those may look like, I think maybe that Christians would do well to go back and listen to Kevin's lesson. In fact, if you're a Christian and you post things on social media that have to do with politics, could I just encourage you that at least once a month, you go back and listen to Kevin's lesson. Just go back to our website to September, Kevin Clark, and that first lesson about a Christian and government and politics. I think we'd all do well to listen to that, because it's really easy to take our eye off of what's most important, what Paul was concerned about, and become really concerned about the politics of our brethren. And I'll tell you something else. We probably should think a little bit about how we speak, about how other brethren feel, even about something like the coronavirus. You know, if you didn't read Jonathan's Facebook post this morning, let me encourage you to read it. He spoke to some of this and did so very, very well. And we need to think about that as well, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just amazed at the number of individuals who seemingly become medical experts in the past 3 months and just know evidently everything there is to know about what we're going through with COVID-19. Could I just say that we need to be patient with each other? There are just tons of questions that don't have answers yet. There's much that we don't know yet. And we have brethren in all parts of the spectrum about how they feel about that. I can tell you a couple of extremes. I read from a Christian last night, not a member of our church, but I read from a Christian last night who said, quote, "Every time I see somebody wearing a face mask, I pity them. I pity that they haven't realized that all of this is just a hoax." Well, that's one extreme view about this. I tell you what, we surpassed 100,000 deaths in America today. And so there are a lot of families who've lost moms and dads and grandmothers and grandfathers and sons and daughters. And I want to tell you, it's pretty real to them, not a hoax to them. And so maybe we ought to be careful about sharing those kinds of things. At the other end of the spectrum, I've got a friend who lives in another part of the country that I really do appreciate a lot. But he believes that if there is a second peak wave of coronavirus in the United States, he really believes that everything in our world is going to collapse, that the economy will collapse, that in essence the government is going to collapse and we're going to have anarchy. So those are two polar opposites, right? Most of us are somewhere in the middle of that. But wherever we may be, we need to understand there's a lot of things we don't know yet. Most of us are just doing the best we can, trying to stay as safe as we can. We all have different ideas about that and thoughts about that. We need to be patient with each other about that. We need to be tolerant of each other about that. And as we said in the document that you received yesterday regarding the return into our building, if we're going to err about that, we're going to err on the side of caution and safety. We want to make sure that if we make a mistake, it'll be a mistake of being too cautious, not too cavalier. So, Paul just says in this chapter, man, I love brethren everywhere. I just love brethren everywhere. He said in Romans 14, you know what? He said, if meat makes my brother to offend, I will not eat meat while the world stands. That's a good philosophy, isn't it? That we're just going to watch out for each other and we're going to be tolerant a little bit of each other. A little bit of that goes a long way. We need to be really concerned about the faith of others. That's what Paul was concerned about. He was concerned about them. He wanted to make sure that nobody was on spiritual life support. He wanted to make sure that they were doing okay. And that really is what consumed him. And I'll tell you what's interesting about that. Paul was concerned about people who were radically different than him. He hadn't even known them very long. He wasn't there very long. And his background was radically different than these Thessalonians. His background was thoroughly steeped in Judaism from the day he was born. But the Thessalonians, their background was pagan idolatry. We've said you could look from Thessalonica and you could see the mount where they believed the pagan gods lived. And so their backgrounds were completely different. Their history was different, their traditions were different, their customs were different, and yet Paul had tremendous affection for these people, even though they were so radically different. It's just amazing the kind of care that Paul had for brethren, all brethren. Listen to what he said to the Colossians. I want you to know what great conflict I have for you and for those in Laodicea and for as many as have not seen my face in the flesh. But he says, I care about them. I love them. I want their hearts to be encouraged and knit together in love and attain the riches of the full assurance of understanding. I want them to understand the knowledge of the mystery of God in the Father and in Jesus Christ. There's a reason why we sing in our churches, blessed be the tie that binds our hearts in Christian love. And so Paul says, you know what? When I could no longer endure it, when I couldn't stand it anymore, I decided that it would be best for me to be left in Athens alone. Now, I think that toll, isolation, was probably heavier than any workload that Paul had. It's not good to be isolated. God created us for community. And he says, you know what? I sent Timothy. Now, if you remember any of the history from the book of Acts, this whole business in Thessalonica, this comes from, Acts chapter 16 and 17 in that area. And so Paul, Silas, and Timothy, they have to leave Thessalonica and they go down to Berea. And the persecutors from Thessalonica follow them and stir up opposition to them down in Berea. And so Paul leaves and he goes to Athens. Silas and Timothy stay in Berea. Timothy later joins Paul in Athens. And then finally, Paul says, you know what? I'm willing to just stay here in Athens alone. Timothy, I need you to go and encourage the people in Thessalonica, the Christians, and then come back and tell me how they were doing. So that's a little bit of the background there. Now, Timothy was the perfect person to do that because he was a brother. So he was a Christian himself. And more than that, he was a minister. He was a servant of God and servant of brethren. And he was a fellow laborer. In other words, he was a team player. In all the things that we read about Timothy in the New Testament, in the epistles, you never read about Timothy trying to draw attention to himself. He just doesn't do that. So if you want a good summary of Timothy, Paul would say about him, I trust in the Lord to send Timothy to you shortly, that I also may be encouraged when I know your state. I have no one like-minded who will naturally, sincerely care for your state. What a great compliment. I mean, wouldn't it be a great compliment to have the great Apostle Paul say, you know what? I got nobody like him. Man, he loves people so much, he just naturally cares for everybody. We all know people like that. This church is full of people like that. What a great statement that is. You know, so much of the work of the apostles was establishing baby Christians, new Christians, helping them get a firm root and hold, to be able to stand on their own 2 feet spiritually. That's so important. That work is still important today. Because you think about it, what do newborn babies need? Well, newborn baby Christians need the same thing as newborn babies. They need nourishment. They need food. Peter said we've got to desire the sincere milk of the word so that we may grow thereby. And they need protection because newborn babies, they can't protect themselves. And newborn baby Christians need Christians to stand by their side and mentor them, shelter them, oftentimes take the blow that they are not, the wound maybe, that baby Christian is not able to take yet. And so they need to be protected. And they need bonding, just like physical newborn babies need bonding. I mean, all those studies indicate that newborn babies have got to be held by their mom, held by their dad. That bonding has to take place. And that's got to take place with baby Christians as well. There's a reason why baby Christians are born into the family of God, because they need spiritual moms and dads, and they need brothers and sisters. They need to be able to bond and gain strength. And so Paul says, I'm going to send Timothy, and I want him to encourage you and establish you concerning your faith. In 1 Thessalonians 3:3, he said that no one should be shaken by these afflictions. You yourselves know that we were appointed to this. He didn't want anybody to be shaken. The word shaken is interesting there. It means to go back and forth. I got to tell you honestly, if we were writing a lexicon in 2020, it's the same concept of the tail on a dog that shakes back and forth. And Paul says, I don't want you being shaken back and forth in your faith because of the difficulties, the persecutions that are coming to you because you become a Christian. He said, we were appointed to this. We were appointed to this. That difficulties are part of the legacy of every Christian. What did Jesus say? John 16, in the world you shall have tribulation, persecution. Be of good cheer. I've overcome the world. Paul said the same to Timothy in 2 Timothy 3:12. And in verse 4 he said, in fact, we told you when we were with you that we would suffer tribulation, just as it happened, as you know. Now, I want us to talk tonight for a couple of minutes about why Paul was so concerned about them. So why is Paul so concerned about these baby Christians in Thessalonica? Well, we've told you part of that. These babies need nourishment, and they need protection, and they need bonding. And so he had to leave. Timothy, Silas, they all have to leave. And so he's going to send Timothy back now to do these things, to help them be established in their faith, to bond with them, to encourage them, and to protect them as best he can. The two reasons why that's so very important for Paul's concern are these. Number one, because he understood that our adversary, the devil, he is a formidable foe. The tempter was strong. Listen to what Paul said in verse 5. For this reason, when I could no longer endure it, I sent to know of your faith, lest by some means the tempter had tempted you, and our labor might be in vain. And so Paul says, look, when I couldn't stand it anymore, I sent Timothy. I've got to know about your faith, because he said, the one thing I know with certainty is that the tempter is strong. And he really is, isn't he? Now, Paul knew that firsthand. Remember in 1 Thessalonians 2:18, Paul said, look, I wanted to come to you, even I, Paul, time and time again, but Satan hindered us. And so Paul knew how powerful our adversary, the devil, is. Peter knew that. You remember what Jesus said to Simon Peter? The Lord said, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked for you that he might sift you as wheat. And so Paul knew. He knew how strong our adversary, the devil, is. He had hindered Paul in being able to come back to them. And he knew this, that the devil had tried to sift Peter's faith like it was wheat. Now here's the point of that. The point is that our adversary, the devil, doesn't make an allowance for new baby Christians. See, Paul's so concerned about these baby Christians. And he says, I'm afraid that the tempter has tempted you, because he knows that the tempter doesn't make allowances for baby Christians. That the tempter doesn't, when you're baptized, he doesn't say, oh, okay, hands off you. I tell you what, I'm going to leave you alone for 6 months to a year. I'm just going to leave you completely alone. I'm going to let your faith in Christ grow and develop and mature. I'm going to let you get rooted in all of that. He doesn't do that. He doesn't wait to begin his onslaught of attack. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, we talk so much about being a church family, because the church has to be a nurturing place, a helpful place, a protective place, a growing place. It has to be a true family, because baby Christians are born into a harsh world. And so this has to be the one place where they are enveloped and protected and loved and fed and given the opportunity to grow. Have you ever thought about some of the ways that Satan has schemed against the church? You know, the book of Acts is it's a wonderful chronicle of those early days and early Christians. And we learn a lot there about some of the ways that Satan has schemed against the church. He did it first through greed and dishonesty. That's Acts 5 with Ananias and Sapphira. And so he tries to destroy the church by this kind of moral corruption of greed and dishonesty that's just a poison that eats away everything. And when that didn't work, he tried to destroy the church by cultivating complaint among Christians. And so you've got that business in Acts 6 of the widows complaining against other widows. Now I want you to think about that. The way that our adversary, the devil, began to try to destroy the work of God in the church was, first of all, by the corruption of the integrity of her members. And when that failed, then he tried to turn the members against each other through complaining. He still operates in exactly the same way. And third, he tries to prevent seekers of the gospel from hearing and believing the truth. In Acts chapter 13, we have a narrative of a government ruler named Sergius Paulus who wanted to hear the word of God. But there was a sorcerer who tried to prevent him. And so Paul speaks to the sorcerer and says, full of all deceit and fraud, you are a son, look at that, you're a son of the devil. You're an enemy of all righteousness. Will you not cease perverting the straight ways of the Lord? But I want you to notice what Paul says. The effort to prevent a genuine seeker of the gospel from hearing and believing, he said, that's a work of the devil. You're a son of, you are an instrument of the devil. And fourth, Satan schemes against the church by stirring up violence and persecution against Christians. That's everywhere in the book of Acts. How many times do we see the Apostle Paul fleeing one city for his life, going to another, only to have the persecutors from the previous city find out where he is and follow him there and repeat the pattern again? Who's behind all of that? Well, our adversary, the devil's behind all of that. And in this passage, in 1 Thessalonians 3, it's hardship and persecution. It's hardship and persecution. Maybe you've seen this little sign that says, God is in heaven and all is right with the world. Well, you know what, ladies and gentlemen? Half of that statement is true. Half of that statement is true. God is in fact in heaven. And that's true, beyond a shadow of a doubt. But in the passage that we're reading this evening in 1 Thessalonians 3, look at verse 3 again. I don't want you to be shaken by afflictions. I told you afflictions would come. Verse 4, in fact, we told you before when we were with you that we would suffer tribulation. And so God is in heaven. That's certainly true. But all is not right in the world, as we've said countless times. It's a fallen world. It's a world that's not as God initially designed it. It's a fallen world. Peter would talk about that. Peter says, look, beloved, brethren, don't think it strange concerning the fiery trial, which is to try you, as though some strange thing has happened to you. That is, again, Christians don't get out of the world unscathed. He would go on and say in 1 Peter 5, be sober and vigilant. Your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may desire. Resist him steadfast in the faith. And look at this. Knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. You know, I think when difficulties come in our life, we think, why is this happening to me? And Peter says, look, you're not a special case. The brotherhood in the world, all Christians, if you live in your faith, you're probably going to face some challenges about that. Remember in Luke 8 and 13, Jesus, and he told that parable, the sower. He said, the ones on the rock are those who, when they hear, receive the word with joy, but they have no root, and so they believe for a while. But when temptation comes, when tribulation comes, when persecution comes, when difficulty comes, when hardship comes, they fall away. And so Paul, he's concerned about those baby Christians because the tempter was strong. And secondly, he was concerned because he was afraid that his labor might have been wasted. That's what he says, isn't it? I sent to know of your faith, lest by some means the tempter had tempted you, and our labor might be in vain. Now, please understand, he's not saying that for his own benefit, his own sake. He's not saying, you know what, you might have wasted my time. That's not what he's saying. He says this for their sake. He said, man, I'm afraid that my labor might have been in vain. I'm afraid that maybe you haven't learned enough and you haven't grown enough and you haven't made enough progress. And so if the tempter tempts you, you may not have enough depth and root in the soil of faith to stand firm. Listen to what Paul said in Colossians 2. As you therefore have received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him. Listen to it. Rooted in him, built up in him, established in the faith as you've been taught, abounding in the faith with thanksgiving. You know what, ladies and gentlemen, if we look at the reverse of that, the reverse of that is that Satan's greatest spokesman, his exhibit A, is a failed Christian. Now, a failed Christian typically is going to fall into one of three categories. It's someone who just really didn't grasp the life of Christ. They may have been baptized, but it didn't take. They never grasped living the life of Christ. Or secondly, it's someone who never really committed their heart to Christ. And so they've lived, and they go to church and they do the right things and say the right things, but they've never really committed their heart to Christ. And so they might do the right things on Sunday, but they don't do the right things for the rest of the week because the commitment's not really ever been made there. And then third, there are those who the Christian life took and they committed their heart, but at some point in time, something happened and they abandoned their faith. That's Satan's exhibit A, his greatest spokesman. That's why when we read the capstone of the Bible, the book of Revelation, that's why a dozen times it talks about overcoming. Because all of us began as brand new baby Christians. And we had to learn to stand on our spiritual 2 feet. And then we could walk, and then we could make a little progress. We proceeded one step at a time until we finally, the Hebrew writer's language is, we began to run the race. And so we stood, we walked, but eventually we run. That's overcoming. That's what it says 12 times in the book of Revelation. We got to overcome because there are going to be some hurdles. And so if we're running, it's not a nice, flat, even course. No, it's hurdles. And sometimes it's the high hurdles. You know, sometimes you hear people say, man, it's hard to be a Christian. And sometimes you'll hear people say it's hard to be, and they'll define what kind of Christian they're talking about. It's hard to be a teenage Christian. It's hard to be a divorced Christian. It's hard to be a single adult Christian. It's hard to be a single parent Christian. It's hard to be the only Christian in your family. It's hard to be the only Christian in your workplace. You know what? All of that's true. Nobody's going to deny any of that. That's why, again, a dozen times in the book of Revelation, the statement is, You got to overcome. You got to overcome. Look at verse 5 again with me in the text. For this reason, when I could no longer endure it, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter has tempted you, and our labor might be in vain. Again, it's important to understand who's behind the difficulty that individual Christians and collectively churches have. It's the tempter. That word tempter, obviously, clearly is designed to take us back to the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3, or maybe to Jesus in the Judean wilderness in Matthew chapter 4 and in Luke 4. And when does he especially tempt? In times of difficulty. Think again what we read a moment ago out of 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 7 through 10, where Peter says, look, don't think that when difficulties come your way because you're a Christian, that you're a special case. The same sufferings are endured by your brotherhood in the world. When Paul finishes that statement, he talks about two things that they need to use to make sure that the tempter is not successful in tempting them and that his labor among them will not be in vain. And he's going to talk about two items on the spiritual crash cart. Now let me just explain the concept, and then we'll pick up in the next Bible class, whether you watch that Saturday night or sometime on Sunday, we'll pick up right here with these two items on the spiritual crash cart. Now, if you've ever worked in a medical setting, you know exactly what a crash cart is, don't you? That when a patient is coded, when they've stopped breathing, man, there are all kinds of bells and alarms that go on, and there are special codes that are called over the PA, and brought in is a special crash cart. Doctors and nurses immediately rush to the scene, and they use the tools that are available on the crash cart to try to save a life. And the spiritual application of that is clear. That Paul says, look, the tempter will tempt you, and I don't want my labor to be in vain. I want you to grow and develop in your faith. I want you to learn. I want you to make progress. I want you to stand and then walk and to be able to run in your faith. And he says, you know what? God has put two things at your disposal, and they are both life-saving, spiritual life-saving. And that's where we'll pick up, the Lord willing, Sunday morning. We're going to talk about those two elements that Paul says God has put in our lives, in the life of every Christian who's a part of the Temple Terrace Church. God's put two things in our life to help us be able to stand, walk, and run, and do it successfully, to avoid the tempter and make sure that whatever labor has been invested in us will not be in vain. So, thank you for listening so well.